The suitcase hit the porch and exploded. Clothes scattered across wet concrete. A blouse landed in a puddle. A cardigan caught on the railing and hung there like a flag of surrender. Stockings, underwear, a lifetime of modest possessions thrown into the gray afternoon light of suburban Pennsylvania. Then came the hand. It pressed hard between her shoulder blades. Not a push exactly. More like a shove you'd give to something you wanted out of your way. Something in the garbage. Something expired. Lorraine Dunmore stumbled forward. Her hip caught the porch railing and pain shot through her left side. She grabbed the wood to keep from falling and stood there breathing hard, staring at a door that used to be hers. The deadbolt turned. She heard it clearly. That solid metallic click she'd heard 10,000 times over 40 years. Then the chain slid into place. A sound like a period at the end of a sentence. She was 72 years old. She was standing on a porch in her housecoat and slippers, and her own son had just thrown her out like something that had spoiled in the refrigerator. Lorraine didn't move for a full minute. She stood there, with her hands on the railing looking at the door. The paint was peeling near the bottom. She'd mentioned that to Mitchell 6 months ago. He'd said he'd get to it. He never did. The door stayed closed. She looked down at her right hand. 2 crumpled dollar bills sat in her palm. She'd forgotten they were there. Change from a loaf of bread she'd bought at the corner store last week. She'd stuffed the bills in her housecoat pocket and never taken them out. $2. That was everything. No phone, no wallet, no keys, no identification, no credit cards, no checkbook. Nothing but a housecoat, a pair of worn slippers, and $2 that wouldn't buy her a cup of coffee, and a sandwich at the diner downtown. A car drove past. The driver didn't look. Across the street, a neighbor pulled into his driveway. He got out of his car. He looked at Lorraine standing on the porch surrounded by scattered clothes. He looked at the closed door behind her. Then he went inside his house and shut his own door. Nobody stopped. Nobody asked if she was all right. Nobody did a damn thing. Lorraine Dunmore had lived in this neighborhood for 8 years. She'd baked cookies for the block party. She'd watched the Henderson kids when their mother had surgery. She'd brought casseroles to 3 different funerals. And now she was standing on a porch with her underwear in a puddle, and not a single person on that whole street looked twice. That's when she understood something important. She was invisible. She had been invisible for a very long time. Lorraine bent down and started picking up her clothes. Her knees ached. Her hip throbbed where she'd hit the railing. Her hands shook as she gathered the blouse from the puddle and wrung it out. Water ran brown between her fingers. The blouse was ruined, but she folded it anyway and set it on the dry part of the porch. The suitcase latch had broken when it hit the concrete. The lid wouldn't stay closed now. She gathered what she could and stuffed it back inside. She'd have to carry it with both hands to keep everything from spilling out again. She didn't cry. That's the thing you need to understand about Lorraine Dunmore. She was 72 years old, and she had been through enough in her life that crying wasn't in the toolbox anymore. Crying was for people who still believed tears would change something. Lorraine had stopped believing that a long time ago. She picked up the suitcase. She held it against her chest like a child. She turned away from the door and walked down the porch steps. one foot in front of the other. No plan, no destination, just movement, just the simple act of not standing still. The slippers weren't meant for walking on concrete. She felt every crack and pebble through the thin soles. By the end of the block, her feet were already sore. By the second block, she could feel a blister forming on her left heel. She kept walking. Houses passed on either side, lawns she'd admired, gardens she'd complimented, windows where she'd seen families eating dinner together, watching television together, living their lives together. All of it sliding past her now like scenery from a train window. Pretty to look at. Nothing to do with her. A woman walking a small dog crossed to the other side of the street when she saw Lorraine coming. The woman didn't want to deal with whatever was happening. The woman had her own problems. The woman looked away and kept walking and pretended she hadn't seen an old lady in a housecoat carrying a broken suitcase down the middle of a suburban street at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon. Lorraine didn't blame her. She might have done the same thing once. 8 years. That's how long she'd lived in that house. 8 years of cooking breakfast and dinner. 8 years of cleaning bathrooms and vacuuming carpets. 8 years of picking up grandchildren from school and helping them with homework, and pretending she didn't hear the things that were said about her when they thought she wasn't listening. It started when Earl died. Earl Dunmore, her husband of 44 years, a man who'd worked at the same factory for 30 years, a man who handled all the money because that's what men did in their generation. The bills, the taxes, the savings, the investments. Everything went through Earl. Lorraine signed what Earl told her to sign. She deposited what Earl told her to deposit. She trusted him because that's what wives did. You trusted your husband. You didn't ask questions. You didn't look too closely at the checkbook, because that wasn't your business. Earl died on a Saturday morning in the garage. Heart attack. Dropped dead while changing the oil on his truck. 1 minute he was alive and complaining about the cost of filters. The next minute he was on the concrete floor with his eyes open and his mouth slack and his hands still reaching for a socket wrench. Lorraine found him an hour later when she went to tell him lunch was ready. The funeral was on a Wednesday. The casket was closed because Earl wouldn't have wanted people staring at him. The church was half full. Some relatives, some co-workers, a few neighbors who came out of obligation. Lorraine sat in the front pew and accepted condolences and shook hands and said, "Thank you, thank you, thank you," until the words lost all meaning. Then the dust settled. And that's when she found out the truth. Earl had secrets. Credit cards she'd never seen. A second mortgage she'd never signed. Debts going back years. Gambling debts, it turned out. Earl had been driving to the casino 2 towns over every Thursday night for the past decade. Earl had been losing money steadily, methodically, desperately. Earl had been drowning and he'd never said a word. Within 6 months, the bank took the house. Lorraine came home one afternoon to find a notice on the door. Foreclosure. She had 30 days to vacate. She stood in the driveway of the house where she'd raised 3 children, and she read that notice 4 times because the words didn't make sense. How could they take her house? She'd lived there for 40 years. Her name was on the deed. Her name was on the debts, too. Everything Earl signed, she'd signed. every loan application, every credit card, every refinancing document. Her signature right next to his trusting, obedient blind. The car went next, then the furniture, then the jewelry Earl had given her on anniversaries. All of it sold to pay creditors who kept coming with their hands out, taking and taking until there was nothing left to take. Lorraine walked out of that foreclosure with 2 suitcases and a box of photo albums. That was everything she had left of 44 years of marriage. Mitchell offered to take her in, her eldest son, the responsible one, the one who'd gone to college and gotten a good job and married a woman named Brenda who came from money. They had a nice house in the suburbs, 4 bedrooms, a finished basement, a spare room that nobody used. Mitchell said it like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Mom, you'll come live with us. We have the space. It's not a problem." Lorraine heard what he wasn't saying. She heard the hesitation before, "not a problem." She saw the look Brenda gave him when he made the offer, a look that lasted half a second, a look that said, "Are you sure about this?" A look that said, "This better be temporary." But what choice did she have? Her daughter lived in California with a husband who didn't like visitors. Her younger son was between jobs and between apartments and between everything else. Mitchell was the only option. So Lorraine packed her 2 suitcases and her box of photo albums and moved into the spare room in her son's house. And for a while, it worked. Lorraine understood the deal. You live in someone else's house, you earn your keep. You stay quiet. You take up as little space as possible. You make yourself useful. Because the moment you stop being useful, you become a burden. And burdens get put down. She cooked breakfast every morning. Eggs and bacon for Mitchell. Toast and fruit for Brenda. Pancakes for the grandchildren on weekends. She had the coffee ready before anyone came downstairs. She had the table set. She had the newspaper waiting by Mitchell's plate. She cleaned. Bathrooms, floors, windows. She did the laundry and folded it and put it away in the right drawers. She ironed Mitchell's shirts even though he said she didn't have to. She wanted to. She needed to be useful. She picked up the grandchildren from school, Tyler and Audrey, 12 and 14 when she moved in. She drove them to soccer practice and piano lessons and friends' houses. She helped them with homework at the kitchen table. She packed their lunches when Brenda was too busy. Lorraine made herself small. She ate after everyone else had finished. She watched television in her room with the volume low. She went to bed early and got up early and tried to be invisible in the best possible way. Present but not imposing. Helpful but not intrusive. There but not quite there. She had spent a lifetime learning how to do exactly that. But over 8 years, the math changed. Tyler got his driver's license. Then Audrey got hers. They didn't need rides anymore. They had their own cars, their own schedules, their own lives that didn't include a grandmother sitting in the living room watching game shows. They stopped asking for help with homework. They stopped eating breakfast at the table. They grabbed granola bars and ran out the door, and Lorraine was left sitting alone with 3 place settings that nobody needed. The house felt smaller than it used to. Brenda started talking about renovations. A new kitchen with granite countertops. A finished basement with a home theater. A deck out back with a built-in grill. Big plans. Expensive plans. Plans that required money that seemed harder and harder to find. Money got tighter. And that's when the comments started. Little ones at first. Brenda would mention the water bill and glance at Lorraine. She'd sigh about the cost of groceries while putting things away. She'd say things like, "It's amazing how much 3 people eat compared to 2. Lorraine heard every single word. She heard the edge beneath the casual tone. She heard the resentment building like pressure in a pipe. She heard what Brenda wasn't saying out loud, but was thinking every time she looked at the old woman sitting in her living room using her electricity, eating her food, taking up space that could be used for something else. Lorraine never responded. She'd been quiet her whole life. Quiet through a marriage that wasn't easy. Quiet through a childhood that wasn't easy either. Quiet was what she knew. Quiet was safe. Quiet meant you didn't make things worse. But Brenda's comments got louder. By year 7, they weren't comments anymore. They were conversations. Conversations that happened in the master bedroom between Mitchell and Brenda. Loud enough for Lorraine to hear through the wall. Loud enough that she wondered if they wanted her to hear. Brenda said the house was too crowded. She said they needed that spare room for an office. She said they couldn't afford a new roof with a 3rd adult eating through the budget every month. She said Lorraine should go to a facility, a nursing home, somewhere with people her own age, somewhere she'd be taken care of by professionals. Mitchell never raised his voice, not once. He never argued with his wife. He never defended his mother. He never said, "Maybe we should wait," or "Maybe we should think about this," or "Maybe she deserves better after raising us for 20 years. He just let Brenda talk until she was done. And then he agreed. The morning it happened started like any other morning. Lorraine was sitting at the kitchen table eating toast. Just toast. She'd stopped making big breakfasts months ago because nobody ate them anymore. The coffee pot was full, but nobody had poured a cup except her. The house was quiet. Tyler had gone to college the previous fall. Audrey was a senior in high school, already accepted to a university 3 states away. The nest was emptying. The grandmother in the spare room was becoming harder to justify. Brenda walked into the kitchen. She was dressed for work, a gray suit, sensible heels. Her hair was pulled back in a way that made her face look harder than usual. She put both hands flat on the counter and looked at Lorraine the way you'd look at an item on a list that needed to be checked off. "We need to talk," she said. Those 4 words, Lorraine had been waiting to hear them for months. She set down her toast and folded her hands in her lap and prepared herself for what came next. Brenda said they'd looked into some options. Senior living communities, assisted care facilities, places with activities and social events and medical staff on call. She had brochures. She pushed them across the table. Lorraine looked at them. Smiling old people playing cards. Smiling old people doing water aerobics. Smiling old people eating in a cafeteria that looked like a hospital pretending to be a restaurant. She didn't touch the brochures. She looked at Mitchell instead. He was standing by the coffee maker with his back turned. He was pouring himself a cup even though the cup was already full. He didn't move. He didn't turn around. He didn't say anything at all. Brenda said the timeline was the end of the month. 3 weeks. That should be enough time to get her things together and make arrangements. The facility had an opening. Everything was ready. All Lorraine had to do was agree. Lorraine said she understood. She got up from the table. She left her toast half-eaten. She walked to her room and closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed for a very long time. She didn't pack right away. She thought maybe something would change. Maybe Mitchell would knock on the door and say this wasn't right. Maybe he'd remember the woman who had raised him, fed him, held him when he was scared, worked double shifts to pay for his college applications. The knock never came. But Brenda didn't wait until the end of the month. 3 days later, she was at the bedroom door. It was noon. Lorraine was folding clothes and putting them in the suitcase she brought 8 years ago. The same suitcase, still battered, still held together with hope. Brenda said the timeline had moved up. A friend of hers had called. The facility had an opening right now. Today. If they didn't take it, someone else would. It was a good opportunity. It would be better for everyone. Lorraine asked for one more day. Just one day. 24 hours to say goodbye to the house, to pack properly, to call her daughter in California and her other son wherever he was. One day didn't seem like too much to ask after 8 years of cooking and cleaning and taking care of grandchildren. Brenda said no. She said it flat. No hesitation, no apology. Just no. And Mitchell stood behind her, hands in his pockets, eyes on the floor. He didn't look at his mother. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, like a man who had already made his decision and was waiting for it to be over. Lorraine kept packing. She moved slowly. Her hands were shaking, but she kept folding clothes and putting them in the suitcase. She didn't have much. 8 years in someone else's house, and she didn't have much at all. A few clothes, a few books, a few photographs in cheap frames. Brenda watched from the doorway. Her arms were crossed. Her foot was tapping. "You need to move faster," she said. Lorraine didn't respond. "I said you need to move faster. The car is coming in 20 minutes. Lorraine kept packing at the same speed. She was 72 years old. She would pack at the speed she could pack. She would not be rushed out of the last 8 years of her life like a hotel guest who'd overstayed checkout. Brenda's patience snapped. She crossed the room in 3 steps. She grabbed the suitcase off the bed. She carried it to the hallway, down the stairs, through the living room and out the front door. Lorraine followed. She was still holding a cardigan. She was still in her housecoat and slippers. She hadn't brushed her hair. She hadn't put on proper shoes. She followed her suitcase through the house and watched Brenda carry it onto the porch and drop it. The latch broke. The suitcase popped open. Clothes scattered across wet concrete. And that's when the hand came. The shove between the shoulder blades. The stumble forward. The grab for the railing. The door slamming. The deadbolt turning. The chain sliding into place. That's how a 72-year-old woman ended up on a porch with $2 and nowhere to go. Lorraine walked 11 blocks to the bus station. Her slippers weren't meant for walking on sidewalks. By block 3, the thin soles were wearing through. By block 6, the left sole had peeled half off and was flapping with every step. By block 9, she was walking on fabric and feeling every piece of gravel through her foot. Her feet were bleeding by the time she reached the station. She could feel the wetness in her slippers. She could feel the sting where blisters had broken, and raw skin was rubbing against rough fabric. But she kept walking because what else was there to do? Stand in the middle of the sidewalk and wait for someone to help her. Nobody was coming to help. Nobody had helped in 8 years. The bus station was a gray building with a flat roof and windows that needed cleaning. Greyhound. She remembered bus stations from her youth. They all looked the same fluorescent lights, the same plastic chairs, the same tired people waiting to go somewhere else. She sat on a metal bench and looked at the route board. Destinations rolled past on the display: New York, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Baltimore. Cities she'd never seen. Cities she had no reason to visit. Cities full of strangers who wouldn't care about an old woman in a housecoat carrying a broken suitcase. And then she saw it. Carver Falls. Not Carver Falls exactly, but a stop close to it. A small town 30 miles away where the bus passed through on its way to Albany. She could get off there. She could find a way to Carver Falls from there. Carver Falls. She hadn't thought about that place in decades. A small town in upstate New York. Population 2,000 and shrinking. The kind of town that young people left as soon as they were old enough to leave. Lorraine had left when she was 18. She got on a bus then too. Went south. Got married. Had kids. Built a life that looked fine from the outside. She never went back to Carver Falls. Not for holidays. Not for reunions. Not for funerals. Not even when her mother died. Her mother, Colleen Dunmore, a woman who had raised Lorraine alone in a cottage on the edge of town. A woman who worked as a seamstress and took in laundry and grew vegetables in a garden behind the house. A woman who never talked about Lorraine's father because there was nothing to say. Lorraine had grown up believing her father was a man named Harold, who'd left before she was born. A factory worker. A drinker. A man who couldn't handle responsibility and disappeared when things got hard. That's what her mother told her. That's all her mother ever told her. She didn't question it. She didn't question anything back then. Colleen died 34 years ago. Pneumonia, winter. She was alone in the cottage when it happened. Nobody found her for 3 days. A neighbor finally went to check when the lights didn't come on at night and the smoke didn't rise from the chimney. Lorraine got the call on a Tuesday afternoon. She was in her kitchen making dinner. Earl answered the phone. He listened for a minute, then handed her the receiver with a look on his face that told her everything before she heard a single word. "Your mother passed," he said. Lorraine didn't go to the funeral. She told herself it was because of the children. They were young. They had school. She couldn't just leave. She told herself it was because of the expense. Bus tickets, hotel rooms, time off work that Earl couldn't afford to take. She told herself a lot of things. The truth was simpler and harder. She wasn't ready to go back. She wasn't ready to face that cottage and those rooms and all the memories she'd been running from since she was 18 years old. So she stayed home. She signed the papers a lawyer sent her. She let strangers handle the arrangements. She told herself she'd go back someday and deal with the cottage. Deal with her mother's things. Deal with whatever was left. But the will had been specific. Seal the cottage. Don't sell it. Don't rent it. Don't open it. Just seal it and leave it alone until Lorraine came for it herself. Lorraine had always thought that was strange. Why would her mother seal a cottage? What was the point of keeping an empty house locked up for decades? It didn't make sense, but she had her own life to deal with. A husband who needed dinner on the table, 3 kids with their own problems, bills to pay and groceries to buy, and 1,000 small emergencies that demanded attention every single day. She told herself she'd deal with the cottage someday, and someday never came. Until now. A one-way ticket to the closest stop cost $1.90. Lorraine bought it. She had 10 cents left, a dime. She put it in her housecoat pocket next to nothing at all, and sat down in the plastic chair to wait for the bus. The station was mostly empty. A young man with a backpack sat in the corner looking at his phone. An older woman with shopping bags dozed against the wall. A janitor pushed a mop across the floor and didn't look at anyone. Nobody looked at Lorraine either. She was just another tired person waiting for a bus. Just another face in a room full of faces. Invisible. Forgettable. The kind of person you glanced at and immediately forgot. The bus came at 4:15. Lorraine climbed the steps slowly. Her feet screamed with every movement. The driver looked at her ticket and nodded, and didn't ask why an old woman in a housecoat was traveling alone with a broken suitcase. She sat in the back. The seat was worn, and the cushion had lost its spring years ago. She put the suitcase between her knees and held it there with both hands, so it wouldn't fall open again. She folded her hands on top of it and watched Pennsylvania slide past the window. 6 hours. No food, no water, no phone to call anyone, even if she'd had someone to call. The woman in the seat next to her fell asleep within 10 minutes. She was young, maybe 30. She had earbuds in and her head tilted against the window, and she didn't say a word to Lorraine the entire trip. A man across the aisle ate a sandwich, turkey and cheese on white bread. He ate it slowly, carefully, wiping his mouth with a paper napkin after every bite. He didn't offer any to the old woman across from him. Why would he? She was a stranger. She was nothing to him. Lorraine didn't expect him to share. She wasn't the kind of person people noticed. She wasn't the kind of person people helped. She'd made peace with that a long time ago. You couldn't spend 72 years learning to be invisible and then expect people to suddenly see you. The bus rolled north. Pennsylvania flattened and then folded into hills. The towns got smaller. The spaces between them got wider. The farms stretched out like quilts laid across the land, green and brown and gold in the late afternoon light. By the time the sun started going down, Lorraine could smell pine through the cracked window. That smell. She hadn't smelled it in 54 years, but she recognized it immediately. The sharp, clean scent of pine forests in upstate New York. The smell of her childhood. The smell of the cottage where she'd grown up. The smell of the last place on earth she'd ever wanted to go back to. The bus pulled into a gas station on a 2-lane road outside Carver Falls. It wasn't a real bus station, just a parking lot with a shelter and a bench. The driver called out the stop and 2 people got off. Lorraine was one of them. The other was a man with a duffel bag who walked off in the opposite direction Without looking back, Lorraine stood in the parking lot and looked around. She hadn't been here since she was 18. Nothing looked familiar except the mountains. They rose in the distance the same way they always had. Dark shapes against a sky that was turning purple with dusk. The main street was half a mile away. She walked toward it because she didn't know what else to do. Her slippers were barely holding together now. Every step sent pain shooting up through her heels. The town had changed. The diner where she'd eaten breakfast as a girl had changed names 3 times. The hardware store was boarded up. The movie theater was gone, replaced by a dollar store that looked like it might close next month. Half the storefronts were empty, windows covered with newspaper, doors that hadn't opened in years. Carver Falls was dying. She could see it in the empty streets, in the closed shops, in the way the few people she passed looked at her like she was a ghost. Maybe she was. Maybe she was the ghost of everyone who'd ever left this place and never come back. She asked the gas station clerk for directions to the old Dunmore property. The clerk was young, maybe 25. He shrugged and said he didn't know any Dunmores. The name meant nothing to him. He hadn't been alive when Colleen Dunmore was still breathing, but a woman pumping gas overheard. She was older, 60s. Gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She looked at Lorraine for a long moment and something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, maybe. Or just curiosity. "The Dunmore place," she said. "The sealed cottage. You mean old Colleen's house?" Lorraine nodded. The woman pointed east, past the grain elevator, past the old school, down a gravel road that followed a creek for about 2 miles. You couldn't miss it. It was the only house out there. The only house that had been standing empty for 34 years. "Nobody goes out there," the woman said. "Nobody has since she died." Lorraine thanked her and started walking. The gravel road was worse than the sidewalks. Sharp stones cut through what was left of her slippers. Within half a mile, she was walking on bare feet, with nothing between her skin and the rocks but bloody fabric. Her feet left red marks on the white stones. But she kept going. She kept going because there was nowhere else on this planet for her to go. She kept going because stopping meant lying down in a ditch and waiting for morning. And she was too stubborn for that. She kept going because her mother had left a cottage out here somewhere. And that cottage was the only thing in the world that belonged to her. The road followed the creek. She could hear water running somewhere in the darkness. The sound was familiar. She'd fallen asleep to that sound for 18 years. She'd woken up to that sound every morning of her childhood. The sun was gone now. The sky was dark blue, fading to black. Stars were coming out. A half moon rose over the mountains and cast silver light across the fields. And then she saw it. Past an overgrown field where wildflowers had grown waist high. Behind a rusted iron gate that had collapsed on one side. Through a tangle of weeds and brush that had spent 3 decades reclaiming what humans had abandoned. Her mother's cottage. Small. Stone foundation. Wooden frame weathered gray by decades of rain and snow. A tin roof gone brown with rust. The chimney still stood straight, but no smoke had risen from it in 34 years. The windows were shuttered from the inside. The front door had 2x4s nailed across it in an X pattern, sealed, just like the will said. Lorraine pushed through the broken gate. The iron was rough against her palms. Weeds grabbed at her housecoat. Thorns scratched her legs. But she pushed through until she reached the porch. The steps groaned under her weight. Wood that hadn't held a person in decades complained at the pressure. But the steps held. The porch held. The house was still standing after all this time. Lorraine stood at the front door and looked at the boards. They'd been nailed there 34 years ago. Good lumber. Solid nails. Someone had meant for that door to stay closed. Someone had meant for this cottage to remain exactly as it was until the right person came to open it. Lorraine didn't have a hammer. She didn't have tools of any kind, but she found a loose piece of iron railing from the collapsed gate. She picked it up and tested its weight. Heavy enough. Strong enough. It would work. She wedged the iron between the first board and the door frame. She pushed. Her arms shook. Her shoulders burned. Her hands screamed where blisters had already formed from carrying the suitcase, but she pushed harder. She pushed with everything she had left. The board creaked. The nails groaned. And then, with a sound like a bone breaking, the first board came free. It took her 20 minutes to remove all the boards. Her palms tore open on the rough iron. Blood ran down the railing and dripped onto the porch. She could feel splinters buried in her skin. She could feel her body failing, exhausted, pushed past every reasonable limit. But one by one, the boards came free. She threw them into the weeds behind her, each one lighter than the last, each one a victory over 34 years of silence. When the last board fell, she stood there breathing hard. The door was old wood, painted white once, now gray and peeling. A simple brass knob that had turned green with age. No lock that she could see, just the knob. She reached out. Her hand was shaking. Blood smeared across the brass as she gripped it. She turned. The knob moved. The latch clicked. The door swung open on hinges that should have screamed with rust, but didn't. They moved smoothly, quietly, as if they'd been oiled yesterday. Lorraine stood in the doorway and looked into the cottage where she'd grown up. And everything she expected was wrong. She expected decay. 34 years sealed up. No air circulation. No maintenance. No one to fix leaks or kill bugs or stop the slow, inevitable rot that claims every abandoned building. She expected mold climbing the walls, ceilings that had collapsed under the weight of water damage, floors buckled and broken, animal nests in every corner, the smell of death and decay and forgotten things. That's what happens to a house that nobody touches for 3 decades. But that's not what she found. She stepped inside and stopped. The air was cool, still, dry. No mildew smell. No animal droppings on the floor. No cobwebs stretching between the furniture. Nothing that suggested this house had been empty for more than a few days. Furniture stood in every room covered in white sheets, like ghosts standing guard, like sentinels waiting for someone to come home. Lorraine pulled off the first sheet. Underneath was a wooden rocking chair, clean, polished, not a speck of dust. The wood gleamed in the moonlight coming through the open door. She pulled off another sheet. A side table, intact. A lamp with a glass shade that should have been shattered by now. A small stack of books that should have been eaten by mice. Everything exactly as it should be. She walked into the kitchen. The table stood in the same place it had stood when she was a girl. Polished maple. 4 chairs around it. She ran her hand across the surface and felt wax. Someone had waxed this table before covering it. Jars lined the shelves, preserves, pickled beets, green beans, sealed tight with wax. She looked at the dates written in her mother's careful handwriting. 34 years old. 34 years sealed in glass, waiting. She opened a cabinet. Dishes stacked neatly. Glasses without a single crack. Cups that should have been covered in dust but weren't. Everything clean. Everything perfect. Everything waiting. She opened the drawer by the sink. Her mother's kitchen scissors were right where they'd always been. The same scissors Colleen had used to cut fabric for the dresses she made. The same scissors Lorraine had been forbidden to touch as a child. The whole cottage looked like someone had walked out yesterday. Not 34 years ago, yesterday. The walls hadn't sagged. The floor hadn't buckled. The stone foundation had held everything together like a fist, like a promise, like a mother who refused to let go. It made no sense, but it was real. And Lorraine Dunmore was not about to question a miracle. She stood in the middle of her dead mother's kitchen and felt something she hadn't felt in 8 years, maybe longer. Safe. The cottage was solid. The roof didn't leak. The well pump out back still worked when she primed it. She pumped the handle up and down until water came cold and clear, and she drank from a tin cup that had sat in the same spot on the counter since she was a girl. That water. She remembered that water. Cold enough to make your teeth ache. Clean enough to taste like nothing at all. The best water she'd ever had in her life, and she'd forgotten it until now. She sat at the kitchen table. She put her hands flat on the polished wood, and she just breathed. For the first time since Earl died, she wasn't in anyone's way. She wasn't asking permission to exist. She wasn't waiting to be told to leave. She wasn't shrinking herself to fit into someone else's life. She was home. The word surprised her. She hadn't thought of this place as home in 54 years. She'd thought of it as the place she'd escaped from, the place she'd left behind, the place she'd spent half a century trying to forget. But it was home. It had always been home. And somehow, impossibly, it had been waiting for her. She found blankets in a cedar chest at the foot of her old bed. The room was exactly as she'd left it. The same narrow bed, the same small dresser, the same window that looked out at the mountains. She made a bed on the old couch in the living room because she wasn't ready to sleep in her childhood room yet. Some memories needed more time. She ate canned peaches from her mother's shelf, 34 years in a sealed jar, and they were still sweet. The syrup was thick and golden and tasted like summers she'd forgotten. Lorraine closed her eyes, and she slept deeper than she had in a decade. The kind of sleep where you don't dream because your body finally trusts where it is. The kind of sleep she hadn't known since before Earl died. Maybe since before she got married. maybe since the last time she'd slept in this cottage as a girl. Deep, dreamless, safe. She woke up the next morning to sunlight cutting through the shutters, golden lines across the floor, dust motes dancing in the beams, the smell of old wood and cedar and something else, something she couldn't identify but recognized anyway. Her mother. The cottage still smelled like her mother. Lorraine got up slowly. Her body ached from the journey. Her feet throbbed where blisters had burst and bled. Her hands were stiff from gripping the iron railing. But she was alive. She was here. And for the first time in 8 years, she was home. She opened the shutters one by one. The cottage filled with warm gold light. Morning light. The kind of light that makes everything look possible. The kind of light that makes you believe things might work out after all. She looked around the room she'd grown up in. The fireplace with its stone mantel. The rocking chair where her mother used to sit in the evenings. The window that looked out at the mountains. And that's when she saw it. On the mantel above the fireplace, half hidden behind a framed photograph of a woman Lorraine didn't recognize. A yellow envelope, aged and faded, sealed with red wax. Her name written on the front in her mother's careful handwriting. Lorraine. Just that. Nothing else. She crossed the room slowly. Her heart was beating fast now. Her hands were trembling again. She picked up the envelope and held it for a long time. The paper was soft with age. The wax seal was dark red, almost brown. The handwriting was unmistakable. She would have recognized it anywhere. Her mother's hand, reaching out from 34 years ago, reaching out from beyond the grave. Lorraine broke the wax. She opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, 2 pages, filled with that same careful handwriting. And the first 3 words changed everything. I knew you'd come. I knew you'd come. Lorraine read those 4 words 3 times before she could move past them. Her mother's handwriting, her mother's voice, reaching across 34 years of silence to speak directly to her. She sat down in the rocking chair by the fireplace, the same chair her mother had sat in every evening. The wood creaked under her weight, but held firm. Everything in this cottage held firm. Everything had been waiting. She smoothed the letter on her lap and read. The letter didn't start with apologies. It didn't start with love or regret or any of the things daughters expect from their dead mothers. It started with instructions. Go to the cellar. The lock combination is your birthday, month, day, year. Open the door. Everything you need is below. Lorraine stopped reading. The cellar. She remembered the cellar from her childhood. A dark space beneath the kitchen where her mother stored preserves and root vegetables. Lorraine had been forbidden to go down there alone. Too dangerous, her mother said. The stairs are steep. You could fall. But there had been something else in her mother's voice when she talked about the cellar. Something that went beyond concern for a child's safety. A warning. A wall. A door that was meant to stay closed. Lorraine had never questioned it. She never questioned anything back then. She looked at the second page of the letter, but forced herself to stop. Her mother had given instructions. Read them. Follow them. Then read the rest. Colleen Dunmore had been a woman of order, a woman who did things in sequence, a woman who expected her daughter to do the same, even from the grave. The cellar hatch was in the pantry. Lorraine found it exactly where she remembered. A square cut in the wooden floor hidden beneath a braided rug that her mother had made by hand 50 years ago. The rug was faded now. The colors had bled together into a muddy brown, but the weave was still tight. The craftsmanship still held. She pulled back the rug. The hatch was made of heavy oak planks held together with iron bands. A brass padlock hung from a hasp, bolted to the floor. The lock was old, but solid. Green with age, but not corroded. Someone had oiled it recently. Someone had maintained it. The lawyer, Lorraine thought. The lawyer her mother had hired to handle the estate. He must have come out here. He must have kept the cottage sealed and preserved according to her mother's wishes. But why? Why seal a cottage for 34 years? Why maintain it? Why keep the lock oiled and the preserves fresh and the furniture polished beneath white sheets? What was worth protecting for that long? Lorraine knelt on the floor. Her knees ached against the hard wood. She reached for the padlock and turned the dial. Her birthday, October 14th, 1953, 1, 0, 1, 4, 5, 3. The dial clicked with each number. Smooth, well-maintained, ready. She pulled the lock and it opened on the first try. The hasp swung free. The hatch was unlocked for the first time in 34 years. Lorraine lifted the heavy oak door. The hinges groaned but moved. Cool air rose from the darkness below. The smell of earth and cedar. The smell of secrets kept too long. She found a flashlight in the kitchen drawer. Her mother's flashlight. The batteries were dead, but there were fresh ones in the same drawer still in their packaging. Someone had left them there. Someone had thought of everything. She replaced the batteries. The light flickered once, then held steady. She descended the wooden stairs into the darkness. What she found down there changed everything she thought she knew about her life. The cellar was larger than she remembered. 10 feet by 20 feet. Stone walls that had been whitewashed at some point. A concrete floor that was clean and dry. No water damage. No mold. No decay of any kind. Shelves lined every wall. Not jars of preserves. Not root vegetables in wooden crates. Documents, boxes of them, manila folders, leather binders. A filing system that looked like it belonged in a law office not beneath a farmhouse in upstate New York. Labels on every box, written in her mother's hand. Block letters, neat, precise. Land, trust, taxes, legal, personal. Each label clear. Each box sealed with packing tape that had yellowed with age but held firm. Lorraine stood at the bottom of the stairs and stared. This wasn't a cellar. This was an archive. This was a vault. This was 34 years of careful planning hidden beneath the kitchen floor, waiting for the one person who knew the combination. Waiting for her. She pulled the first box off the shelf. The one labeled land. It was heavier than she expected. She carried it up the stairs and set it on the kitchen table in the morning light. Her hands were shaking as she cut the tape. Inside were documents. land deeds, not just for the cottage and its quarter-acre plot, deeds for the surrounding land, 42 acres total, fields to the north, forest to the west, creek frontage along the entire eastern boundary, all of it in Colleen Dunmore's name, all of it legally recorded and notarized at the county clerk's office, all of it paid in full. Lorraine spread the documents across the table. Her mother had owned 42 acres of land, prime land, land with water access and timber rights and mountain views, land that must be worth something even in a dying town like Carver Falls. But how? Her mother had been a seamstress. She'd taken in laundry. She'd grown vegetables and sold them at the farmer's market. She'd lived simply frugally, counting every penny. How had she bought 42 acres of land? Lorraine dug deeper into the box. Tax records, filed in order by year. Every year from 1971 to the present. Property taxes paid in full. On time. Without fail. She checked the most recent receipt. Paid through 2027. Someone had been making those payments. Someone had been maintaining this property for 34 years. Quietly. Faithfully. Without ever mentioning it to anyone. The receipts showed the payments came from a trust account at a bank in Albany. A trust. Lorraine went back down to the cellar. The second box was labeled Trust. She brought it up to the kitchen and opened it with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. Bank statements, going back to 1971. A trust account opened with an initial deposit of $5,000. Monthly contributions after that, small at first, $25, $50, then larger as the years went on. $200 a month by the 80s, $500 a month by the 90s. The statements were organized by year. Lorraine flipped through them, decade after decade of careful saving, interest compounding, dividends reinvesting, the money growing quietly, steadily like a tree nobody was watching. She found the most recent statement, printed 6 months ago, mailed to something called the Aldrich Law Firm in Carver Falls. Current balance, $412,000. Lorraine set the statement down on the table. She stepped back. She put her hands over her mouth. $412,000. She read the number again, then again, then a third time because the words didn't make sense. Numbers like that didn't exist in her world. Numbers like that belonged to other people, rich people, lucky people. People whose husbands didn't gamble away everything and whose sons didn't throw them out on the street. 24 hours ago, she had $2. 24 hours ago, she was standing on a porch with a broken suitcase and nowhere to go. 24 hours ago, she would have done anything for a hot meal and a safe place to sleep. And now this. $412,000. 42 acres of land. A cottage that had been sealed and preserved and waiting for her for 34 years. Lorraine sat down at the kitchen table. She put her head in her hands. She breathed slowly, deeply, trying to keep the world from spinning out from under her. This was real. This was really happening. But why? How had her mother, a seamstress in a small town, accumulated over $400,000? Where had the money come from? Who had been making those monthly deposits for over 50 years? She needed to read the rest of the letter. But first there was one more box, smaller than the others, Not cardboard, wood. A small wooden box wrapped in cloth. No label on this one, just clean white linen tied with string. Lorraine had found it in the far corner of the cellar behind the other boxes, as if it had been hidden. As if whatever was inside was different from the rest, more personal, more dangerous. She unwrapped the cloth carefully. The wooden box was old, hand-carved. The kind of thing a craftsman might make for someone he loved. The lid was held closed with a simple brass latch. She opened it. Inside was a single document in a protective plastic sleeve. A birth certificate. Lorraine's birth certificate. But not the one she'd grown up with. Not the one that had listed Harold Dunmore as her father. The man who'd left before she was born. The factory worker. The drinker. The ghost who'd haunted her mother's silence for as long as Lorraine could remember. This certificate was different. It had been issued by a different county. It had a different file number. It had been sealed by court order and stored separately from public records. And the line for father didn't say Harold Dunmore. It said Warren Stockwell. Lorraine's hands were shaking so badly, she could barely hold the document. Warren Stockwell. She knew that name. Everyone in Carver Falls knew that name. Everyone in the whole county knew that name. The Stockwell family had owned the largest dairy operation in the region for 3 generations. They'd built the town library. They'd funded the fire department. They'd paved roads and donated land for the high school football field and put their name on every public building worth naming. Warren Stockwell had been the patriarch. Old money. Old family. Church every Sunday. A handshake that could get a loan approved or a road paved. He'd been married for 50 years to a woman named Catherine. They'd had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter, all of them still alive, all of them still running what was left of the family business. Warren Stockwell had died in 1992. His obituary had run on the front page of 3 newspapers. Lorraine had seen that obituary. She'd been living in Pennsylvania by then, married to Earl, raising 3 children. She'd seen the name in the paper and felt a flicker of something. Recognition, maybe. Memory. Something from her childhood that she couldn't quite place. She'd turned the page and forgotten about it, but now she was holding a birth certificate that said Warren Stockwell was her father. Not Harold Dunmore. Warren Stockwell. Lorraine set the document down on the table. She stepped back from it like it was something hot, something dangerous, something that could burn. Her whole life. 72 years of believing one thing. 72 years of thinking she knew where she came from. 72 years of carrying her mother's silence like a weight around her neck. And it was all a lie. She went back to the letter. Page 2. The part her mother had told her to read after she'd seen what was in the cellar. The explanation. The truth. The story that Colleen Dunmore had carried alone for over half a century. The handwriting was the same. Careful. Precise. But there was something different about it now. Something that looked like trembling. Something that looked like fear. James and I were together for 2 years before you were born. James. Her mother had called him James, not Warren. Not Mr. Stockwell, James. The name a lover would use. The name that meant something private, something real. He was already married when we met. He had a family, a name to protect, a business that depended on reputation. I knew all of that from the beginning. I knew what I was getting into. When I told him I was pregnant, he offered to pay, to make it go away. That was the phrase he used, make it go away. As if you were a problem to be solved. As if you were something shameful that needed to be hidden. I said no. He offered to take you after you were born, raise you as his own, give you his name, his money, his life. All I had to do was disappear, move away, start over somewhere else, pretend I'd never had a child. I said no to that too. I wasn't going to let my daughter grow up as someone's secret. I wasn't going to let you spend your life wondering why your mother abandoned you. I wasn't going to give you to a man who thought you were a problem to be solved. So I kept you, and he let me. That surprised me. I expected him to fight. I expected lawyers and threats, and all the things rich men do when poor women make trouble for them. But Warren was different. He didn't push. He didn't threaten. He just asked what I needed. I told him I needed to raise you myself. I told him I needed enough money to do it right. I told him I needed him to stay away unless I asked for help. He agreed to all of it. He set up the trust. He bought the land around the cottage and put it in my name. He said it was for you when the time came, when you needed it, when the world had pushed you far enough that you'd come looking for what I'd left behind. He knew that day would come. I knew it too. We never spoke again after you were born. He kept his distance. He lived his life with his wife and his children and his dairy farms and his charitable donations. And I lived mine with you. But he never forgot about you. The deposits into the trust came every month, like clockwork, for 50 years. Even after he died, the deposits continued. He'd arranged for that. He'd put money aside. He'd made sure the trust would keep growing until you came to claim it. That was his gift to you. The land, the money, the cottage. That was his way of saying he was sorry for never being your father. Lorraine put the letter down. She couldn't read anymore. She sat in the rocking chair for a long time. The morning light moved across the floor. The shadows shifted. The cottage settled around her with small creaks and groans, the sounds of an old house breathing. 72 years. She had spent 72 years believing she was the daughter of Harold Dunmore, a factory worker who drank too much, a man who yelled too much, a man who broke things when he was angry, a man who walked out when she was still in her mother's belly without a word, without a forwarding address, without ever looking back. That story had shaped everything. Her tolerance for bad situations, her silence in rooms where she should have spoken, her willingness to be small, to shrink, to accept whatever space other people decided to give her. She had learned to be invisible because her father had been the kind of man who made noise, the kind of man who took up space, the kind of man who hurt people when they got in his way. She had spent her whole life trying to be the opposite of that. And he wasn't even her father. Harold Dunmore was a ghost that had haunted every decision she'd ever made. And now, sitting in her mother's rocking chair in a cottage that had been sealed for 34 years, she learned he didn't exist. The lie wasn't cruel. She understood that now. The lie was a wall her mother had built around her, a wall to protect her from the truth, from the Stockwell family, from the questions that would have followed if anyone knew who her real father was. Colleen Dunmore had looked at her options and chosen the one that kept her daughter safe, a fake father who'd left before she was born. Better than a real father who could never claim her. Better than growing up as the secret shame of the richest family in town. Better than spending her childhood wondering why her father lived in a mansion while she lived in a cottage on the edge of nowhere. The lie had held for 50 years, and it had worked. Until now. There was more to the letter. Lorraine forced herself to pick it up again, forced herself to read the final paragraphs. Her mother's last words. The explanation she'd been waiting 34 years to give. I sealed the cottage because I didn't trust his family. Warren was a good man. Better than you might think. Better than I expected. But his children are not him. They didn't know about you when he was alive. They don't know about you now. And if they found out after I was gone, they would come for everything. The land, the trust, the cottage, the truth. They would have challenged everything, hired lawyers, claimed fraud, said I forged the documents, said I was a liar and a gold digger and whatever other words rich people use when poor people try to claim what's rightfully theirs. They would have buried the truth. So I buried it first. I sealed the cottage. I locked the cellar. I put everything in order and I waited. I knew you'd come someday. I knew the world would push you here eventually. The world always pushes people back to where they started. All you have to do is claim it. The land is yours. The money is yours. The cottage is yours. The truth is yours. Take it. Take all of it. And don't let anyone tell you that you don't deserve it. You are Warren Stockwell's daughter. You are my daughter. You deserve everything. The letter was signed with a single word. Mom. Lorraine cried. For the first time in years. Maybe the first time in decades. She sat in her mother's rocking chair, and she cried until her chest hurt, until her eyes burned, until there were no more tears left. She cried for her mother, who had carried this secret alone for so many years. She cried for herself, who had never known the truth. She cried for the little girl who had grown up believing her father was a monster, when her real father had been paying for her future every single month, quietly, faithfully, without ever asking for anything in return. She cried for all the years she'd spent being small, being quiet, being invisible. All the years she'd accepted less than she deserved because she believed she came from nothing. Because she believed she was nothing. And when she was done crying, she stood up. She wiped her face with her hands. She looked around the cottage. Her cottage now. Her land. Her money. Her truth. And she knew exactly what she had to do next. The Aldrich law firm was on Main Street. Lorraine found the address in her mother's documents. A business card, old and soft at the edges, tucked into the folder with the trust statements. The card said, Aldrich and Associates. The address said 127 Main Street, Carver Falls. She walked into town the next morning. Her feet were still sore. The blisters had scabbed over, but every step reminded her of what she'd been through to get here. She'd found shoes in her mother's closet. Old shoes, but sturdy. They fit well enough. She carried a folder under her arm. The important documents. The birth certificate. The trust statements. The land deeds. The letter. Everything she needed to claim what was hers. The law firm was in a converted house, white clapboard, black shutters, a brass plaque by the door. The original Aldrich was long retired according to the documents. His son ran the practice now, Glenn Aldrich. She'd found his name in the files. Glenn Aldrich, son of Theodore Aldrich, who had been Colleen Dunmore's attorney for 40 years. Theodore had set up the trust with Warren Stockwell. Theodore had paid the property taxes every year. Theodore had kept the cottage sealed and maintained according to Colleen's instructions. Theodore had been waiting. And now his son was waiting. Lorraine pushed open the door. The receptionist looked up from her desk. She was young, maybe 25. She looked at Lorraine with the kind of expression people give to unexpected visitors. Polite, but uncertain. Ready to offer help, but also ready to call security if necessary. Lorraine understood. She was an old woman in borrowed shoes carrying a folder of documents. She didn't look like a typical client. She looked like someone who might be lost. Someone who might be confused. Someone who might need to be gently redirected to the proper authorities. "I'm here to see Glenn Aldrich," Lorraine said. "My name is Lorraine Dunmore. I'm Colleen Dunmore's daughter." The receptionist's expression changed. Something flickered in her eyes. Recognition. Or maybe just awareness that this was important. That this wasn't a confused old woman who'd wandered in off the street. "Just a moment," the receptionist said. "Let me see if he's available." She disappeared down a hallway. Lorraine waited. The office was quiet. Wood paneling, leather chairs. The kind of furniture that said, old money, old trust, old relationships built over generations. The Aldrich family had been serving Carver Falls for a long time. Footsteps in the hallway. A man appeared. Mid-50s. Gray at the temples. Quiet hands that hung loose at his sides. He looked at Lorraine and something happened to his face. He looked at her like she was someone he'd been expecting in a dream. "Mrs. Dunmore," he said. "Or is it Mrs. Collins now?" "Dunmore," she said. "I kept my maiden name." He nodded slowly. "My father told me about you," he said. "Before he died. He said someone would come for the file someday. He didn't know when. He just said to be ready." He stepped aside and gestured down the hallway. "Please, come in. We have a lot to discuss." The office was small but comfortable. Glenn Aldrich sat behind a desk covered with papers. He moved some aside to make room. He gestured for Lorraine to sit in the chair across from him. She sat. He looked at her for a long moment. "You have her eyes. he said. Your mother. I met her once when I was young. My father brought me along to the cottage. I remember thinking she was the most serious person I'd ever seen, like she was carrying something heavy that nobody else could see. She was, Lorraine said. Glenn nodded. The documents, he said. You found them. In the cellar. Everything was there. The deeds, the trust statements, the birth certificate. She placed the folder on his desk. And the letter. Glenn didn't open the folder. He didn't need to. He already knew what was inside. My father helped set up everything, he said. The trust, the land purchases, the arrangement with Warren Stockwell. He was the intermediary, the go-between. He made sure everything was legal, documented, unassailable. He reached into his desk drawer. He pulled out a file, thick, dog-eared. The kind of file that had been opened and closed hundreds of times over the years. He kept his own records, Glenn said. Notes from every meeting, copies of every document. He wanted to make sure that when you came there would be no questions, no gaps, nothing that could be challenged. He slid the file across the desk. And there's one more thing. Glenn opened the file to a specific page, a letter, handwritten, on cream-colored stationery with a monogram at the top. The initials W.S. in elegant script. Warren Stockwell. This was written in 1988, Glenn said. 4 years before he died. He gave it to my father with instructions to keep it sealed until you came to claim the estate. He handed the letter to Lorraine. She took it carefully. The paper was heavy, expensive, the kind of stationery that rich men used for important correspondence. She read, To whom it may concern. I, Warren James Stockwell, of sound mind and body, do hereby acknowledge and affirm the following Lorraine Dunmore. Born October 14th, 1953, is my biological daughter. Her mother, Colleen Dunmore, and I were in a relationship from 1951 to 1953. I was married at the time. I take full responsibility for this. Colleen made the decision to raise our daughter alone. I supported this decision both emotionally and financially. The trust account established in 1971 at First National Bank of Albany, account number 7734829, was funded entirely by me and is intended solely for the benefit of Lorraine Dunmore. The land holdings in Colleen Dunmore's name, totaling 42 acres in the Carver Falls Township, were purchased with funds I provided and are intended to pass to Lorraine Dunmore upon Colleen's death. I ask that my daughter be allowed to inherit in peace. She has done nothing wrong. She did not choose her circumstances. She deserves to receive what I have set aside for her without interference from my other heirs or any other party. This is my final wish regarding this matter. The letter was signed with a flourish, Warren James Stockwell, and below the signature witnessed and notarized by Theodore Aldrich, attorney at law. Lorraine held the letter for a long time. Her father's handwriting, her father's words, her father's acknowledgement. 72 years old, and this was the first time she'd ever heard him speak to her. The first time she'd ever known what he thought about her. The first time she'd ever been anything other than a secret. This is real, she said. It wasn't a question. It's real, Glenn confirmed. handwritten, notarized, witnessed by my father. It will hold up in any court. Court. Glenn's expression darkened. The Stockwell family doesn't know about you, he said. Warren never told his wife. He never told his children. As far as they're concerned, this land is unclaimed property that should revert to the county. They've been trying to buy it for years. He pulled more documents from the file. Purchase offers, sent to the estate of Colleen Dunmore, starting about 5 years after she died. Polite at first, then aggressive, then written by lawyers using words like eminent domain and adverse possession. He spread the letters across the desk, all of them unanswered, all of them returned by a post office that had no forwarding address. The Stockwell children have been circling this property for decades, waiting for it to default, waiting for their chance to snatch it up for nothing. He looked at Lorraine. They don't know you exist. They don't know the land has a living heir. And when they find out, they're not going to be happy about it. The legal process took 5 weeks. Glenn filed paperwork to establish Lorraine as the rightful heir to the land, the cottage, and the trust. He submitted the birth certificate for authentication by the state. He unsealed Colleen's will, which had been held in the Aldrich firm's vault since 1991. The will named Lorraine as sole beneficiary. Everything her mother had owned, everything Warren Stockwell had given, all of it left to the daughter who had finally come home. Word got out. In a small town like Carver Falls, word always gets out. Someone at the county clerk's office mentioned the filing to someone else. That someone mentioned it to a friend. That friend mentioned it to a cousin who worked for the Stockwell family. Within 2 weeks of the filings hitting county records, the Stockwell family found out, and they came hard. 3 attorneys from a law firm in Albany, expensive suits, leather briefcases, the kind of lawyers who charged more per hour than most people made in a week. They filed challenges to the deeds. They challenged the authenticity of the birth certificate. They said Colleen Dunmore had forged the documents. They said Warren Stockwell had been manipulated by a woman who wanted his money. They filed a motion to freeze the trust. They filed another motion to have Lorraine declared mentally incompetent. Their argument was simple and vicious. She was a homeless woman with no verifiable identity making outlandish claims. That was the word they used. Outlandish. As if the truth was something ridiculous. As if a man acknowledging his daughter was beyond belief. Glenn Aldrich fought every one of them. He filed responses, affidavits, exhibits. He brought in a handwriting expert who examined Warren Stockwell's letter and confirmed it was genuine. He pulled county records showing trust payments going back 50 years. He produced his father's notes from meetings with both Colleen and Warren. Every piece of evidence Colleen had stored in that cellar was authentic. Every piece told the same story. A man had loved a woman. That woman had become pregnant. The man had done what he could within the limits of his circumstances. The woman had protected her daughter for a lifetime. And now, decades later, the truth was demanding to be heard. The hearing was held on a Tuesday morning. Lorraine sat in the county courthouse wearing a dress she'd bought at a thrift store in town. Navy blue. Simple. The kind of dress you wore when you wanted to look respectable without looking like you were trying too hard. She sat up straight. She folded her hands in her lap. She didn't flinch when the Stockwell attorneys called her a fraud. She didn't flinch when they suggested she'd broken into the cottage and planted the documents herself. She didn't flinch when they implied she was mentally unstable, desperate, delusional. She answered every question with the same steady voice she'd used her whole life. The voice of a woman who had learned a long time ago how to take a hit without going down. The Stockwell children didn't come to court. Not one of them. They sent their lawyers. They sent their money. They sent their accusations and their motions and their expensive legal arguments. But they never sat in that courtroom and looked Lorraine in the eye. Maybe they couldn't. Maybe they knew somewhere deep down that their father had secrets. Maybe they'd suspected for years that there were things he'd never told them. Maybe they were afraid to see the truth sitting in a chair across from them, wearing a thrift store dress and borrowed shoes. Whatever the reason, they stayed away, and their absence said everything. Warren Stockwell's letter destroyed their case. Handwritten, notarized, witnessed by Theodore Aldrich, who had been the Stockwell family's own lawyer for 20 years before he'd retired. The letter was unassailable. The handwriting expert confirmed it. The notary records confirmed it. Theodore Aldrich's meticulous files confirmed it. Warren Stockwell had acknowledged Lorraine as his daughter. He had done it in writing. He had done it 4 years before he died. He had asked that she be allowed to inherit in peace. The judge read the letter aloud in the courtroom. The Stockwell attorneys objected. They called for authentication. They demanded further analysis. They said the letter could have been forged after Warren's death. The judge denied every motion. "This letter has been in the custody of a licensed attorney for 34 years, she said. It was sealed according to Mr. Stockwell's instructions and opened only when the proper heir came forward to claim the estate. The chain of custody is unbroken. The authenticity is beyond reasonable dispute." She looked at the Stockwell attorneys. "Your client's father acknowledged a child. He provided for that child. He left clear instructions for her inheritance. There is nothing outlandish about a father taking care of his daughter. Your motion is denied." She turned to Lorraine. "Mrs. Dunmore, the court finds that you are the sole surviving heir to the estate of Colleen Dunmore. The land holdings, the trust account, and all associated property are legally and rightfully yours. This matter is closed." The gavel came down, and just like that, it was over. Lorraine walked out of the courthouse into afternoon sunlight. Glenn Aldrich walked beside her. He was smiling, a rare expression on his serious face. "Congratulations," he said. "It's yours, all of it." Lorraine didn't feel like celebrating. She felt tired. She felt old. She felt like a woman who had just fought a battle she never asked to fight. But she also felt something else. Something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt like she mattered. For 72 years, she had been invisible. She had been small. She had been the kind of person who took up as little space as possible, who never raised her voice, who accepted whatever scraps the world decided to give her. But today she had stood in a courtroom and demanded what was hers. Today she had looked expensive lawyers in the eye and refused to back down. Today she had claimed her name, her inheritance, her truth. And no one could take that away from her. Not the Stockwell children with their money and their lawyers. Not Mitchell with his silence and his cowardice. Not Brenda with her impatience and her cruelty. Not anyone. She was Lorraine Dunmore. She was the daughter of Colleen Dunmore and Warren Stockwell. She was the owner of 42 acres and $412,000. And she was finally, after 72 years, exactly who she was supposed to be. She went back to the cottage that evening. The sun was going down behind the mountains. The sky was orange and pink and purple. The kind of sunset you only see in places where there are no city lights to drown out the colors. She sat on the porch. She looked at the land that stretched out before her. Her land, fields and forests, and a creek that caught the last light of the day and turned it into silver. She thought about her mother, about the woman who had kept this secret for over 50 years, who had raised a daughter alone, who had worked and saved and planned and waited, who had sealed a cottage and left a letter, and trusted that someday when the time was right, her daughter would find her way home. That's what this was. Home. Not the house in Pennsylvania where she'd raised her children. Not the spare room in Mitchell's house where she'd spent 8 years trying to disappear. This cottage on the edge of a small town in upstate New York. This was home. It had always been home. And her mother had kept it waiting for her. Through decades of silence, through a lifetime of secrets, through death itself. Colleen Dunmore had reached across 34 years and handed her daughter exactly what she needed, exactly when she needed it. Lorraine sat on the porch until the stars came out. She didn't cry this time. She just breathed. And for the first time in her life, she felt like she belonged somewhere. The cottage needed work. Not much. Not the kind of work you'd expect from a house that had been sealed for 34 years. But small things. Things that time had touched even through closed doors and shuttered windows. The roof had a few loose shingles. Lorraine found them the first time it rained. A steady drip in the corner of the kitchen. She put a pot under it and watched the water fall. One drop at a time. Patient. Persistent. The way time works on everything. The plumbing groaned when she turned on the faucets. The pipes had been dry for decades, and they complained at being asked to work again. But they worked. The water ran brown at first, then clear. The well pump chugged and wheezed but kept pumping. The wiring was old. Knob and tube from the 1920s. The cottage had never had electricity from the grid. Colleen had used oil lamps and candles. She'd cooked on a wood stove. She'd lived the way people had lived for centuries before power lines stretched across the countryside. Lorraine didn't mind. There was something peaceful about the darkness. Something honest about lighting a lamp and watching the flame catch. Something real about a life that didn't depend on switches and buttons and things you couldn't see. But she knew she couldn't live that way forever. She was 72 years old. Her eyes weren't what they used to be. Her hands weren't as steady. She needed light to read by. Heat that didn't require chopping wood. A refrigerator that would keep food cold without blocks of ice from town. She needed to make this place livable. Not just for now. For whatever years she had left. The trust money made everything possible. Lorraine had never had money before. Not real money. Not the kind of money that let you make choices instead of just reacting to whatever happened next. Earl had handled the finances, she'd signed what he told her to sign. She'd trusted him to take care of things. And when he died, she'd discovered that trust had been misplaced. The money had vanished into casinos and credit card bills, and a second mortgage she'd never known existed. But this was different. This money was hers. Her name on the account. Her signature required for withdrawals. Her decisions about how it would be spent. Glenn Aldrich helped her set up a checking account at the local bank. The same bank where her mother had kept a small account for groceries and household expenses. The teller who processed the paperwork looked at the deposit amount, and her eyes went wide. $412,000, transferred from the trust account in Albany. The teller looked at Lorraine, looked at her borrowed shoes and her thrift store dress, looked at her weathered hands and her gray hair and her face that showed every one of her 72 years. She didn't say anything, but Lorraine could see the question in her eyes. Where did someone like you get money like this? Lorraine didn't explain. She didn't owe anyone an explanation. She hired a local contractor to fix the roof. His name was Tom Brennan, 60 years old, hands like leather, a face that had spent decades in the sun and the wind and the cold. He drove up to the cottage in a truck that was older than some of his workers. He walked around the property slowly, looking at the roof, looking at the foundation, looking at the windows and the doors and the porch that creaked under his weight. He didn't say much. When he was done looking, he came back to where Lorraine was standing and took off his cap. "You're Colleen's daughter," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am." He nodded slowly. "I knew your mother. Not well, but I knew her. She used to sell vegetables at the farmer's market. Best tomatoes in the county. She never talked much, but she always gave fair weight. Never cheated anyone." He looked at the cottage. "I was sorry when she passed. She was a good woman." She was. Tom put his cap back on. "The roof needs work. 20, maybe 30 shingles. The flashing around the chimney needs replacing. But the structure is sound. Best stone foundation I've seen in 40 years of building. Someone knew what they were doing when they built this place." He quoted her a price. It was half what she'd expected. "That seems low," she said. Tom shrugged. "Your mother gave me tomatoes when my wife was sick, free of charge. Said she had extra. She didn't have extra. She just knew we were struggling." He looked at Lorraine. "I remember things like that." The roof was fixed in 3 days. Then the plumbing. A crew from Albany came out and replaced the old pipes with copper. They installed a new well pump. They put in a hot water heater and a proper bathroom with a shower and a toilet that flushed. Then the electrical. That took longer. They had to run a line from the road, a 1/4 mile of cable through the trees and across the field. The power company charged her for the poles and the wire and the labor. It cost more than the roof and the plumbing combined. But when they were done, Lorraine flipped a switch and the kitchen filled with light. Electric light. Bright and steady and reliable. She stood there for a long moment looking at the room she'd grown up in. The table where she had eaten breakfast as a child. The counter where her mother had rolled out pie crust. The window that looked out at the mountains. all of it visible now in a way it had never been before. She could see every detail, every crack in the plaster, every worn spot on the floor, every memory that had been hiding in the shadows. Her mother had lived here without electricity for decades. Lorraine understood why. In the darkness, you couldn't see what you'd lost. In the darkness, the past stayed where it belonged. But Lorraine was done with darkness. She was done with hiding. She was done with pretending that the shadows were easier than the light. She bought a proper stove, gas, not electric. She liked the click of the igniter and the blue flame that appeared like magic. She liked the heat she could see and control. She liked cooking the way her mother had cooked, with fire and patience and attention. She bought a refrigerator that hummed quietly in the corner. She bought a bed, a real bed with a good mattress, not the narrow cot she'd slept on as a girl, not the sofa she'd been using since she arrived. A bed that was hers, a bed she'd chosen, a bed she could stretch out in without apologizing to anyone. She bought books, dozens of them, novels she'd always wanted to read but never had time for, histories of places she'd never been, biographies of people who'd lived interesting lives. She filled the bookshelf in the living room and then bought another bookshelf and filled that one too. She bought a radio, not television. She had no interest in television. But a radio, yes. Something that could bring music into the cottage. Something that could fill the silence when the silence got too heavy. She tuned it to a station that played old songs. Songs from the 40s and 50s. Songs her mother used to hum while she worked at the sewing machine. The first time she heard one of those songs, Lorraine had to sit down. The melody hit her like a physical blow. Her mother's voice, not on the radio, in her memory, singing that same song while she stitched hems and mended tears, singing quietly, almost to herself, as if she'd forgotten anyone was listening. Lorraine sat in the rocking chair and let the music wash over her. And she remembered. She remembered everything. Spring came early that year. The snow melted fast. The creek rose with runoff from the mountains. The fields turned from brown to green so quickly, it seemed like magic. Lorraine planted a garden. Not a big one, just a patch of ground behind the cottage, where the sun hit for most of the day. She turned the soil with a shovel she found in the shed. She broke up the clods with her hands. She mixed in compost from a pile her mother had started 30 years ago. The compost was still good, rich and dark and smelling like earth. She planted tomatoes, basil, lettuce, beans, cucumbers, peppers. The same things her mother had grown. The same things Lorraine had helped harvest as a girl, filling baskets with vegetables that would go to the farmer's market. She remembered complaining about the work. She remembered wanting to be anywhere else. She remembered thinking that this life was too small, too quiet, too far from everything that mattered. Now she understood. This life wasn't small. It was focused. There was a difference. The Stockwell family didn't give up easily. Even after the judge's ruling, they kept pushing. Their lawyers filed an appeal, then another. They argued that the original judgment was flawed. They argued that new evidence had emerged. They argued anything they could think of to keep the case alive. Glenn Aldrich fought every motion. He was patient, methodical. The kind of lawyer who understood that justice wasn't about dramatic speeches in courtrooms. It was about paperwork, details, making sure every I was dotted and every T was crossed. The appeals failed, one by one. The higher courts looked at the evidence and came to the same conclusion the original judge had reached. Warren Stockwell had acknowledged his daughter. He had provided for her. His intentions were clear and documented. There was nothing to appeal. The final motion was denied in late April. Glenn called Lorraine with the news. "It's over," he said. "They have exhausted their legal options. The estate is yours, permanently, irrevocably. No one can take it away." Lorraine thanked him. She hung up the phone. She sat at the kitchen table and looked out the window at the mountains. It's over. 2 words. But they meant everything. She thought about the Stockwell children sometimes. Warren's legitimate heirs. 2 sons and a daughter. All of them in their 60s now. All of them running what was left of the family dairy business. They had never met her. They had never seen her face. They had spent months trying to destroy her through lawyers and motions and legal arguments. They had called her a fraud. They had tried to have her declared incompetent. They had done everything in their power to erase her. But they had never once looked her in the eye. Lorraine didn't hate them. She understood them. They had grown up believing they knew who their father was. They had inherited his money and his land and his reputation. They had built their identities around being Warren Stockwell's children. And then a stranger had appeared. A woman they'd never heard of. A woman with a birth certificate that said she was their sister. A woman who threatened everything they thought they knew about their family. Of course they fought. Of course they denied. Of course they tried to make her disappear. That's what people do when the truth threatens to destroy the story they've been telling themselves their whole lives. Lorraine had done the same thing. For 54 years, she had avoided Carver Falls. She had avoided her mother's cottage. She had avoided the truth about who she was and where she came from. She had run. And running hadn't worked. The truth had waited. Patient. Persistent. Like water dripping through a roof. Eventually, it always found a way through. She called Mitchell on a Thursday afternoon, 3 months after the court ruling. 3 months of peace and quiet, and slowly rebuilding a life. 3 months of waking up in her own bed, in her own house, on her own land. She didn't call to reconcile. She didn't call to forgive. She called because there were things that needed to be said. Things that had been sitting in her chest like stones. Things that would poison her if she didn't let them out. Mitchell answered on the 3rd ring. "Mom." His voice was careful, uncertain. The voice of a man who knew he'd done something wrong but wasn't sure how to talk about it. Mitchell. Silence. Neither of them knew how to begin. "I'm calling to tell you where I am," Lorraine said. "I'm in Carver Falls, at your grandmother's cottage, the one she left me. I didn't know she left you anything. Neither did I, until I got here." More silence. "Are you okay?" Mitchell asked. "I'm better than okay. I'm better than I've been in years." She could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, slow, heavy. The breathing of a man who wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. "Mom, I'm sorry. About what happened. About how it happened. I should have... You should have done a lot of things," Lorraine said. "You should have stood up for me. You should have told your wife that I deserve better. You should have given me one more day to pack my things. You should have been my son." Her voice was steady. She wasn't angry. She was just stating facts. "I didn't throw you out," Mitchell said. "That was Brenda. I didn't..." "You stood there," Lorraine said. "You stood there with your hands in your pockets, and you let it happen. You didn't throw me out, but you didn't stop her either. That's the same thing, Mitchell. That's exactly the same thing." He didn't argue. He couldn't argue. She was right, and they both knew it. "I'm not calling to make you feel bad," Lorraine said. "I'm calling because I want you to know that I'm okay. I have a home. I have money. I have everything I need. You don't have to worry about me. You don't have to feel guilty about me. I'm fine." "Mom, I'm not closing the door," she said. "I'm not saying we can never talk again, but I'm not opening it either. Not yet. Maybe not ever. That depends on you, on whether you can be the man I raised you to be." She paused. "I love you, Mitchell. I've always loved you. But love isn't enough. Not anymore. Not after what happened." She hung up before he could respond. The call had lasted 90 seconds. It was enough. The seasons changed. Summer came hot and dry. Lorraine watered her garden every morning before the sun got too high. She picked tomatoes and basil and made sauce in the kitchen with the windows open and the radio playing old songs. She walked the property, all 42 acres of it, through fields where wildflowers grew waist-high, through forests where the trees were so tall they blocked out the sky, along the creek where the water ran cold and clear over smooth stones. She learned every inch of it, every hill, every hollow, every place where the light fell just right in the late afternoon. This was hers. This land that Warren Stockwell had bought for her before she was born. This land that Colleen Dunmore had protected for half a century. This land that had been waiting for her while she lived her small, quiet, invisible life somewhere else. She thought about selling it sometimes. Developers had come calling. Word had gotten out about the Stockwell estate ruling. People with money saw opportunity. They sent letters, they left messages. They showed up at the cottage with business cards and earnest expressions. Lorraine turned them all away. She didn't need more money. She had enough. What she needed was this: the land, the cottage, the view of the mountains, the sound of the creek, the smell of pine in the morning and wood smoke in the evening. She needed to belong somewhere. And she did. Finally, after 72 years, she belonged. Autumn brought color to the mountains, red and orange and gold, the kind of colors you only see in places where the summers are hot and the winters are cold, and the trees have learned to put on one last show before they sleep. Lorraine sat on the porch and watched the leaves change. She had a cup of tea in her hands. The same tin cup she'd drunk from as a child. The same tin cup her mother had used for 40 years. It was dented now. The enamel was worn away in spots, but it still held liquid. It still did its job. Some things lasted. Some things were built to endure. She thought about that a lot these days. Her mother had built something that lasted, not just the cottage or the trust or the legal documents in the cellar. Something bigger than that. A safety net stretched across decades. A gift that couldn't be given until the time was right. Colleen Dunmore had known her daughter. She had known that Lorraine would need help someday. She had known that the world would push her to the breaking point. She had known that there would come a moment when her daughter had nothing left. And she had prepared for that moment. For 50 years. Quietly. Patiently. Without ever saying a word. That was love. Not the kind of love you talked about or celebrated or wrote on greeting cards. The kind of love that showed up. The kind of love that did the work. The kind of love that waited as long as it needed to wait. The first snow came early in December. Lorraine woke up to a white world. The fields were covered. The trees were frosted. The mountains had disappeared behind a curtain of falling flakes. She made coffee and stood at the window and watched. The cottage was warm now. She had hired someone to install a proper heating system, not the wood stove her mother had used. A furnace that ran on propane, clean and efficient and automatic. It kept the cottage at 70 degrees no matter how cold it got outside. Her mother would have thought it was extravagant. Maybe it was. But Lorraine was 73 years old. She had earned a little extravagance. She had earned a lot of things. The snow kept falling all day. By evening, there were 6 inches on the ground. The world was silent, muffled. The kind of silence that only comes with heavy snow. Lorraine built a fire anyway, not for warmth. The furnace handled that. For the sound, for the smell, for the way the flames danced and cast shadows on the walls. She sat in her mother's rocking chair and watched the fire burn. And she thought about all the things she had lost. Her husband, her home, her savings, her son. 8 years of her life spent trying to be invisible in someone else's house. She thought about all the things she had found. A cottage that had been waiting for her. A mother's love that had outlasted death. A father she had never known who had provided for her anyway. A truth that had been buried for 72 years and finally seen the light. She thought about the woman she had been. Small, quiet, invisible. She thought about the woman she was now. Still quiet, but not small. Never small again. The text message came 3 days before Christmas. Lorraine had bought a cell phone. A simple one. Nothing fancy. Just something so she could make calls and receive them without being tied to the landline. She didn't use it much, but it buzzed one afternoon while she was reading by the window. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something made her open it anyway. The message was short. Grandma. Are you okay? It's Audrey. Lorraine stared at the words. Audrey. Her granddaughter. Mitchell's daughter. 17 years old. A senior in high school. The quiet one. The one who always had her nose in a book. The one who reminded Lorraine of herself at that age. Audrey had been in the house that morning. The morning Brenda had thrown her out. Audrey had been upstairs. She must have heard everything. The arguing, the door slamming, the sound of a suitcase hitting concrete. She hadn't come downstairs. She hadn't said anything. She had stayed in her room and let it happen. Lorraine had tried not to blame her. She was just a teenager. What was she supposed to do? Stand up to her mother? Defy her parents? Put herself in the middle of a situation no child should have to navigate? But there had been hurt there. A small wound that hadn't quite healed. Lorraine looked at the message for a long time. Then she typed a response. I'm better than okay. Come see for yourself. She added the address. She hit send. And she waited. Audrey arrived on a Saturday. 6 hours in a used Honda with bad shocks and a heater that only worked sometimes. She pulled up to the cottage in the late morning with snow still on the ground and frost on the windshield. Lorraine watched her get out of the car. 17 years old, tall and thin, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing a coat that was too thin for this weather, and boots that had seen better days. She looked nervous. She looked like she wasn't sure she should be here. She looked like a girl who had driven 6 hours to apologize for something and didn't know how to start. Lorraine opened the door. They stood there looking at each other, grandmother and granddaughter, across 30 feet of snow and 3 months of silence. Hi, Audrey said. Hi. Neither of them moved. I'm sorry, Audrey said. I should have done something. That morning, I heard everything. I was at the top of the stairs, and I heard Mom yelling, and I heard the door, and Her voice broke. Tears were running down her face. I should have come down. I should have said something. I should have stopped her. But I was scared. I was so scared, and I just stayed in my room and I let it happen, and I've hated myself ever since. Lorraine walked down the porch steps. Her feet crunched in the snow. She crossed the distance between them, and she took her granddaughter in her arms. Audrey collapsed against her, sobbing, all the guilt and shame and fear pouring out of her in one desperate rush. Lorraine held her. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. She just held her granddaughter on the frozen ground in front of a cottage that had waited 34 years for her to come home. And something that had been broken began to heal. They went inside. Lorraine made tea. The good tea she'd ordered from a catalog. Earl Grey with bergamot. She served it in proper cups, not the tin one on the windowsill. That one was hers. Audrey sat at the kitchen table. The same table where Lorraine had eaten breakfast as a child. The same table where she had read her mother's letter for the first time. The same table where she had discovered that everything she knew about her life was wrong. This place is amazing, Audrey said. She was looking around with wide eyes, taking in the cottage, the books, the view of the mountains through the window. How long have you been here? Since the day I left your parents' house. The whole time. Audrey was quiet for a moment. Dad never told us where you went. We asked, me and Tyler. But he just said you were fine, and that was all he would say. Like you just disappeared. I suppose I did. But you're okay. You're really okay." Lorraine smiled. "I'm more than okay. I'm home." She told Audrey the story, all of it. The sealed cottage, the letter on the mantel, the cellar full of documents, the birth certificate with Warren Stockwell's name, the trust that had been growing for 50 years, the court case, the Stockwell family's challenges, the final ruling that made everything hers. Audrey listened without interrupting. Her eyes got wider with each revelation. When Lorraine finished, Audrey sat back in her chair and let out a long breath. "So you're like, rich?" Lorraine laughed. An actual laugh. The first one in longer than she could remember. "I suppose I am. Or at least comfortable. More comfortable than I've ever been. And your dad. Your real dad. He was a Stockwell, Warren Stockwell. He died before I ever knew the truth. But he took care of me anyway. In his own way." Audrey shook her head slowly. "That's insane. That's the most insane thing I've ever heard. It's like a movie." "It's like a life," Lorraine said. "A complicated one. But they all are in the end." Audrey stayed for lunch. Lorraine made sandwiches with tomatoes she'd canned from her garden, fresh bread from the bakery in town, good cheese that cost more than she would have spent a year ago, but was worth every penny. They ate at the kitchen table with the winter sun streaming through the windows. Audrey talked about school, about college applications, about a boy she liked but hadn't told anyone about her plans for the future, and her fears about leaving home. Lorraine listened. She remembered being 17. She remembered wanting to escape, wanting to be anywhere but the small cottage on the edge of a small town. Wanting a bigger life than the one her mother had given her. She had gotten that bigger life, and it had nearly destroyed her. But she didn't tell Audrey that. Audrey would have to learn it herself. Everyone did. When it was time to go, they stood on the porch. The sun was starting to go down. The mountains were turning purple and gold. The snow was glowing with the last light of the day. "Thank you for coming," Lorraine said. "Thank you for letting me." They hugged again. Longer this time. Not desperate like before. Just warm. Audrey pulled back and looked at her grandmother. "Can I come back? Like to visit during spring break, maybe?" "You can come back whenever you want. The door is always open." Audrey smiled. It was the first real smile Lorraine had seen from her all day. "I'm gonna hold you to that." "Please do." Audrey got in her car, started the engine, rolled down the window. "I love you, Grandma. I love you too, sweetheart. I'm going to come back. I mean it. I know you do." Audrey put the car in gear. She drove away slowly, carefully down the gravel road that led to the main highway. Lorraine watched until the taillights disappeared around the bend. Then she went back inside. The cottage was quiet. But it wasn't empty. Not anymore. Spring came again. Lorraine's second spring in the cottage. Second spring planting her garden. Second spring watching the snow melt and the creek rise and the world turn green again. She had found a rhythm. Up early. Coffee on the porch if the weather was warm enough. Breakfast, work in the garden, reading in the afternoon. Dinner as the sun went down. Fire in the evening even when the furnace was running. It was a small life, but it was hers. She leased 20 acres to a local farmer who grew hay and kept a few head of cattle. The rent wasn't much, but it was something. More importantly, it meant the land was being used, being cared for, not just sitting empty. She donated 5 acres to the town for a community garden. It opened in April. 20 raised beds where anyone could grow vegetables. A fence to keep out the deer. A small shed for tools and seeds. A sign that said, Dunmore Community Garden in letters painted by the local high school art class. Lorraine was there on opening day. She didn't make a speech. She didn't want attention. But she stood in the corner and watched as families came to claim their plots, as children ran between the beds, as people who had never grown anything before got their hands dirty for the first time. Her mother would have approved. Colleen Dunmore had believed in growing things, in putting seeds in the ground and trusting them to become something more. She had done that with land, with money, with secrets. And she had done it with her daughter. Lorraine kept the rest of the land wild. The forests, the fields, the creek bank. Deer moved through the trees at dusk. Red-tailed hawks circled in the afternoon. The creek ran cold and clear and full of fish that nobody caught because nobody needed to. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that had nothing to do with silence. The kind of quiet that came from peace. Lorraine walked the property every day that the weather allowed. Through the fields her mother had protected. Along the creek her father had bought. Under the trees that had been growing since before any of them were born. She belonged to this land, and it belonged to her. Glenn Aldrich called her one afternoon in late summer. "There's something I thought you should know," he said. "The Stockwell children. They've been asking about you. Asking how, not through lawyers this time, personally. The daughter, Catherine, named after her mother. She called my office, said she wanted to talk." Lorraine was silent. She said she wanted to apologize for the way they handled things, for the accusations, for trying to take away what was rightfully yours. Does she mean it? Hard to say, but she sounded sincere. She said she's been thinking about it a lot, about what her father did, about the choices he made, about you. Lorraine thought about it. Her half-sister, a woman she'd never met, a woman who had tried to destroy her 6 months ago, a woman who shared the same father. "What do you think I should do?" Lorraine asked. "I think that's entirely up to you. You don't owe them anything. Not forgiveness, not conversation, not a single thing. But the offer is there, if you ever want to take it." Lorraine thanked him. She hung up. She sat at the kitchen table and thought about it for a long time. She didn't call Catherine Stockwell, not that day. Maybe someday, but not yet. Some doors needed more time before they could open. Lorraine turned 73 in October. Audrey came up for the weekend. She brought a cake she'd baked herself. Chocolate with chocolate frosting. A little lopsided. a little overcooked on one side. Perfect. They ate it on the porch with the autumn colors blazing on the mountains. "This is the best birthday I've had in years," Lorraine said. "It's just cake and mountains. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything." Audrey smiled. She was 18 now, starting her first semester at college, living in a dorm 2 states away, becoming her own person in a world that was bigger and more complicated than she'd ever imagined. She came back whenever she could. Spring break, summer vacation, long weekends when she could swing it. The cottage had become her refuge, too. A place to escape the noise, a place to remember who she was, a place where her grandmother sat in a rocking chair and listened without judgment and offered wisdom without insisting it be followed. Lorraine never asked about Mitchell. Audrey never offered. Some silences were better left alone. Winter came again, Lorraine's second winter in the cottage. She knew what to expect now. The snow, the cold, the long nights and the short days. She was ready. The pantry was stocked. The firewood was stacked. The furnace was serviced and running smoothly. She had everything she needed. She sat by the window on Christmas Eve, watching the snow fall. The tin cup was on the windowsill. The same cup that had been there her whole life. The same cup her mother had used. The same cup that connected her to everything that had come before. She picked it up. She turned it in her hands. She felt the dents and the worn spots and the history that had accumulated over decades of use. Her mother had held this cup. Her mother had drunk from it. Her mother had set it in this exact spot, knowing that someday her daughter would find it. Lorraine set the cup back down. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Some things didn't need words. They just needed to be held. The years passed. Lorraine aged. Her hair went white. Her hands got slower. Her eyes needed stronger glasses. But she stayed in the cottage. She tended her garden. She read her books. She watched the seasons change on the mountains. She welcomed Audrey when she came and held space for her when she couldn't. She never heard from Mitchell. He never called, never visited, never reached out. She made peace with that. Some relationships couldn't be healed. Some breaks were permanent. But others could be mended. Audrey came back every chance she got. And when she graduated from college, she moved to a town just 2 hours away. Close enough to visit on weekends. Close enough to be there if her grandmother needed her. Close enough to matter. Lorraine lived to be 81 years old. She died in the cottage on a spring morning. Peaceful, quiet, in her own bed, in her own home, on land that belonged to her, surrounded by books and memories, and the faint smell of the garden coming through the open window. Audrey found her that afternoon. She had come up for the weekend. She had brought flowers from a farm stand on the way. She had let herself in with the key Lorraine had given her years ago. Her grandmother was in the rocking chair by the fireplace. The tin cup was in her hands. Her eyes were closed. She looked peaceful. She looked like a woman who had finally, after a very long journey, found her way home. The cottage passed to Audrey in Lorraine's will, along with the land. along with what remained of the trust, along with the letters and documents that were still stored in the cellar. Audrey kept everything. She didn't sell the land to developers. She didn't tear down the cottage and build something modern. She kept it exactly as it was. A place to escape. A place to remember. A place where 3 generations of women had found shelter when the world pushed them to the edge. She put the tin cup on the windowsill, right where it had always been. And sometimes on quiet evenings, she picked it up and turned it in her hands and thought about her grandmother, about a woman who had been thrown out of her own son's house with $2 and nowhere to go, about a woman who had walked on bleeding feet to a cottage that had been waiting for her, about a woman who had claimed her name, her inheritance, her truth, about a woman who had turned exile into homecoming, loss into legacy, $2 into everything. Audrey set the cup back down. She looked out the window at the mountains, and she understood. Her grandmother hadn't left her a cottage. She had left her a second chance. The same thing her great-grandmother had left Lorraine. The same gift passed down through generations. Not money, not land, not property. Love. The kind of love that didn't announce itself. The kind of love that didn't need to be thanked. The kind of love that just showed up. Decades after the person who planted it was gone. Exactly when you needed it most. Hidden in a cellar. Sealed in an envelope. Waiting for you to come home.